name is Gabor Debreczeni. I'm an economic geographer with WSP, and I have for many years had sort of an interest and passion for equity and social justice and infrastructure. I'm going back to my background in international development before I ended up in WSP, and I now co-run the economic analysis strategy team with Kate Co with an advisory. Thanks so much for joining today. Before I jump in to the actual presentation, just two things to mention to you all. There's going to be a Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions, please feel free to just drop them into the questions box in your GoToWebinar control panel. What was the second thing I was going to mention? I forget. Anyway, it's going to be great. Thanks all of you for joining. So I'll just jump into it. So the first question I think that I really wanted to ask in front of you all is why we care about equity in tolling in the US in the first place. And really the reason is that our highways in the US, as I'm sure many of you are aware, have a bit of a nasty history. Going back to especially the first half of the 20th century, but even a little bit more recently than that, a lot of highways came with sort of pretty flagrant overtones of historical racism. There are a couple really stark examples that are stories that are commonly told. One of the most common ones, for example, is one of the major highways in Atlanta that doesn't go through the city in a way that you would describe as anything remotely resembling straight, was built quite literally as a wall between the historically white and historically black communities in Atlanta. The highway is elevated, it functions as a wall. There's sort of no way to connect through on the streets below them, and this highway still stands today. Another sort of very commonly told story is how in the New York area, a lot of the highways in the New York area have really low bridges that cross them. And this is by design, and the design was that a lot of these highways lead to leisure destinations, sort of most commonly to beaches, but also to some state parks and some other sites. And the idea was that by keeping the bridges low, buses wouldn't be able to go on these highways, and that would keep out more diverse people with lower incomes from these places that were meant to be more exclusive than that. There are dozens of stories like this all around the US. Another one that sort of gets talked about a ton, obviously, is the pattern that we've had of building our highways over primarily Black communities, but a large number of other disadvantaged communities as well. That's sort of another part of our highway history. And then lastly, there is the sort of grand tradition we've had of suburbanization being really hard on disadvantaged people, and that's been true in both directions. At first, when highways were built and it allowed suburbanization to really happen in the U.S., that sort of had the whole experience that I think many of us are well aware of in the 50s, 60s, and 70s of hollowing out the inner cities. And really sort of spatially separating wealth from poverty in the US in a way that was pretty harmful. And in many ways, the opposite is happening today. A lot of poverty in the US is being suburbanized, and the suburbs are a particularly hard place to be poor in the US, sort of not being able to walk to services, walk to family. Is something that is really challenging to people. And I think sort of more and more of our attention to sort of income and wealth inequity in the U.S. is being turned to the question of the suburbs. That's sort of a growing topic. I really bring this up to mention that this is kind of the big reason that highways were a big focal point of the 2020 racial justice protests. There were a lot of marches on highways and marches around highways, signage on highways, and this is sort of the grand story of why that was the case. And the other tie-in to what I want to talk about today is that I've come to be of the understanding that tolls on highways may counterintuitively actually be an opportunity to do some good from an equity perspective. And that's really what I want to discuss today. So in the US, there have been quite a few attempts um, to put into place some kind of an equity program on toll roads, both future and current. And they by and large fall into three categories of options. One is that a number of toll roads have implemented or are considering discounts or periodic waivers or credits on tolls for people with low incomes. The second category is using toll revenues, usually net toll revenues, to fund other neighborhood projects or programs, whether that's bike ped programs, safety programs, even art programs. There's a huge diversity out there. The third broad category is using toll revenues in some capacity to support transit on the highway corridor itself. There are quite a few of these programs that are successful. There's a poster that's shown here completely illegibly to you, but if any of you are interested, it's a couple years old now, but it's a rundown of all the kind of equity programs that have been tried on toll roads around the US, and I'm happy to share it with you. Please just feel free to reach out to me. And the other thing I wanted to mention is I do think these are the kind of three broad categories of equity programs that are out there on toll roads, but within the context of tolling and equity, it's also really important to think about really kind of two or three other things. One of them is cash loading, and this is something I'll talk about a little bit more in the future, but even though a lot of the US has transitioned or is transitioning to all electronic tolling, cash transactions are still really popular. And one of the big reasons for that is that maintaining minimum account balances and maintaining credit and debit cards on transponder accounts, which are usually required, is somewhere between challenging and impossible for people with low incomes and very low incomes. So not having cash loading both has kind of a number of harmful effects. One is that you can exclude people from using the road. The second is that you end up with people with lower incomes in the various sort of violations processes more often. And the third is that if your equity program requires a transponder, which many of them do, then you might be locking out exactly the people you're trying to help from the program. And that's sort of a big conversation that needs to happen on almost all of these projects. And the last thing I wanted to mention here really quickly is just why income on the income-based discounts. This is a question that comes up sort of really often. Options might include like, you might instead want to benefit a certain geography. You might want to benefit people with lower wealth. You might want to benefit people who have sort of fewer opportunities historically. And I think all of that is really valid. The reason that income has become sort of the determining threshold is because it's seen to be sort of legally neutral is I think one part of it. And I think the second part of it is that it's relatively easy to measure. I think you might in theory want to sort of threshold a program like this on wealth instead, but that's just impossible from a data perspective, unfortunately. And this is something that sort of benefit programs all around the US and all around the world, frankly, really struggle with, which is that like you really would more likely want to be thinking about wealth, but you just can't, unfortunately, from a sort of data and operations perspective. So the actual project that I wanted to talk about briefly, it's sort of completed a little while ago now, but we were working closely with the Washington State Transportation Commission, who are, among other things, the toll rate setting authority for the state. And they were asked by the state legislature to consider the possibility of implementing a low-income toll program on various managed lanes in the Seattle area. I'll talk about what all that means in a little bit, but here I just wanted to highlight really quick that we had a big team at WSP working on this, and also we worked very closely, obviously, with various folks at the Transportation Commission and a number of other stakeholders from state agencies. We had a lot of really good feedback and knowledge from a lot of these sources. So I just wanted to acknowledge that broader team here. So the actual managed lanes we were looking at are in Seattle, which for those of you abroad is a city of about 4 million people in the metro area in the northwest of the US. And what we were looking at is an existing managed lanes facility. So essentially toll lanes on the side of a highway that are tolled with the rates changing based on time of day and congestion. And the actual highway we were looking at has about 100,000 to 200,000 AADT, so average daily traffic. So a pretty busy roadway, like not one of the busiest in the US, but really quite busy. sort of varies between 4 and I think 6 or 8 lanes. I forget the exact number, but it sort of varies based on the geography, which is quite big because the corridor is about 50 miles long. And the actual study was a kind of question of, this infrastructure is already there, it's already being built, but we suspect that people with low incomes are benefiting less from it than others. How can we help them sort of achieve a greater benefit of this infrastructure already being there? And the study considered impacts on corridor users, nearby residents, as well as implementing agencies. So it sort of looked at this problem from a lot of angles. And the focus in the study was on discounts and credits by legislative direction. So of the sort of 3 categories I highlighted earlier of equity programs in the US, this was very squarely in bracket 1. And as I mentioned, a couple of programs like this exist already in the US. The biggest ones are in Los Angeles and Virginia on the Elizabeth River tunnels, as well as a very significant number of similar programs on transit, water, and power. So this idea is out there. And a number of other agencies are actively implementing or actively studying it. The various agencies in California are really far along, as is Colorado, as is Oregon, and as is Minnesota. Our team is also quite involved in Oregon's low-income tolling program, so I'll probably be making some references to that in this presentation as well. And as I mentioned here, several others are starting to discuss. I would say this conversation comes up on a majority of tolling projects in the US that I'm involved in these days. So definitely exciting movement forward. And before I actually kind of jump into what was happening directly in Washington, I'll just kind of mention really quickly that I think equity and infrastructure lesson number 1 is, and this is a conversation we have to have at the beginning of every project we work on, is just that everywhere is unique and every place and every project has its own equity needs and challenges. And so the very first thing we have to do is kind of go in and speak to people and attempt to figure out what the local equity challenges are and begin to problem solve from there. I'll give you one local example from Washington of what I mean by this. So very early on in the project, we were pointed to a study out of the University of Washington that any of you who are interested in tolling equity, I greatly encourage you to read it, that looked into the behavior of people with low incomes on these managed lanes that we were studying. And their kind of biggest punchline result to my eyes was that they were finding that people with lower incomes were using the managed lanes less often, which you'd expect, but they were using them disproportionately when tolls were high. And they were using it when tolls were high because that's when time savings were high. And so they were behaving sort of selectively, choosing to use the lanes only when the benefits were high, but it also meant that the costs were high at that time. And really the punchline to this is that people with lower incomes were accruing more benefit from these lanes on a per trip basis, but people with higher incomes were still accruing more benefits overall, which was an interesting kind of local conclusion. And probably the most sort of interesting aside punchline to this was the conversation that in this context, raising the minimum toll on this facility is likely pro-equity. Because the times when the toll is at its lowest are the times when primarily wealthier people are in the lanes, which is just sort of not necessarily what we might have guessed going in. So one of the things that we actually did in this project that I want to talk about a little bit is we built a framework that was based on a sort of very high level quantitative and qualitative assessment of various options for what this program could look like. These were evaluated both through this framework I'm outlining that evaluated the kind of level of user benefit, the operational impact on the roadways, the feasibility of implementing it, the cost of the program, and balanced all of that with a survey that we conducted of people who actually use these roadways, as well as some feedback from various stakeholders. And kind of putting this framework together, I think really allowed us to both acknowledge that this was a sort of high-level first phase study in terms of in terms of choosing what a program like this might look like, but did allow us to apply some rigor to the kinds of things that we were thinking and stakeholders were thinking, and allowed us to kind of clear our minds with regard to what the best possible options are out there. And where we eventually landed collectively is two options, one of which is a $50 a month toll credit, and the second is 10 free trips per month for people who are enrolled in this program. And one thing that's important and meaningful about these numbers is that for the average user, this would cover all toll travel. So the idea essentially was that for someone who's using the lanes occasionally and has a lower income, they would be able to use the lanes for free, generally speaking. You know, they'd be able to use it for emergency trips. They'd be able to have the choice of a reliable trip. But if they're sort of an indiscriminate power user, this program is not going to benefit them quite as much. And furthermore, there were sort of a few additional pieces that we discussed. One was providing them a free toll transponder. The second was setting up an advisory panel for the recurring pilot that would advise on how well this program is working from an equity perspective, as well as numerous kind of accessibility accommodations to make sure that people can broadly enroll. And the kind of last piece that I just really wanted to highlight is I think by framing the program this broadly, and by not restricting it by geography and time of day and trip purpose and a number of things that people tend to bring up, we really wanted to acknowledge that the users can make the decision of when the express lanes are most valuable for them. They know their own lives and needs best, and that was really, really important to all of us. And the last bit I just wanted to mention on this really quick is that we did think a decent bit about the question on account balances and credit and debit card requirements. This is an ongoing challenge for people and agencies, but it's something that we think is really critical. And one of the things that's nice about a sort of credit or free trips framing on a discount program as opposed to a percentage discount is that you could theoretically envision, and in fact the Oregon report discusses this at length, that you might be able to set up a program that doesn't require either a balance or a credit or a debit card for people to enroll, because they have some number of free trips that they can make by being a member of this program. The last thing I'll mention is program promotion is really hard, but one thing that has worked really well in getting people to enroll in programs like this is promotion directly at community festivals. In the sort of priority communities that you're trying to get people to enroll from, going to where people are is something that generally works really well. The very last thing I'll just say about Washington is I'll just talk about a little bit about the modeled impact. So the way that our project finished, the sort of very last phase was an attempt to estimate the actual impact on the roadway if this program were to be launched. And we generally found that there were sort of no very major effects on operations or revenues, although there was some predictable impact, especially to peak usage and to revenues. And the overall estimated impact to revenues was about 3% to 6%, with about a 0% to 13% range. The reason there's such a huge range on these impacts is because enrollment is a huge wild card. We expect a fairly small percentage of people to enroll in a program like this, a fairly small percentage of people who are eligible. This matches the experience not only on other toll benefit programs around the country, but really benefit programs writ large. Even the kind of grand programs, the sort of food stamps and SNAP and discounted lunches and even something like Medicaid it doesn't have anywhere near universal enrollment in the US. And so this is something we wanted to be really aware of. And lastly, also, it acknowledges that enrollment really depends on program details. At the time the study was finished, it was still a little bit uncertain how enrollment would work exactly in Washington, especially with regard to things like account balances. And that question would have a really radical impact on how many people actually enroll in a program like this. So the actual recommendations that came out of this were to advance these two options for further considerations, and to launch a pilot in a number of years, sort of pending legislative funding, as well as to conduct further outreach in those years, as well as to assess the kind of cost and benefits of expanding a program like this to all toll facilities in the state. This report is online, it's complete, it's gone to the Washington State Legislature. The open question is just what they will fund next, and we're waiting with bated breath on that question. The I just want to mention really high level a couple of notes from our kind of further work on this topic, especially our work with Oregon. Um, the We've been doing a decent amount of thinking into tiered approaches. So the idea that you might provide a lot of benefit for people with very low incomes and a smaller amount of benefit for people with moderately low incomes. This has some pros. It's more equitable and more economically efficient, and some cons. It's more complicated and it's expensive to operate. Um, but this is something that is being balanced, I think, in some programs that are being launched currently. There are programs out there with as many as 8 tiers. That's obviously a little bit extreme, but it does work fairly well. And so I think there's sort of a balance to be struck between having sort of one tier and very many tiers. The second is uh, there's sort of an understanding that the federal poverty level is way too low for any sort of understanding of what it takes to survive in the United States. And sort of more modern metrics like ALICE or the self-sufficiency standard really sort of make a grander attempt to understand um, how much income people actually need to not be forced to cut critical expenses like food or medicine or education. And those metrics usually end up somewhere in the range of triple the federal poverty level, but it really depends by region, and that's an important thing to understand. And then lastly, there's a growing conversation around self-certification. So essentially at a very high level, not checking people's income, but allowing them to assert their income, usually with some kind of a signed statement. This is obviously much less expensive to administer administratively and results in more enrollment and is frankly kinder, and generally sees low rates of fraud, at least in the transportation discount context. This is something that we're continuing to research and a number of agencies are continuing to talk about. It's very much I think on the vanguard of the conversation. Um, and then just very lastly, just the kind of question of sort of what's next. As I kind of mentioned, more agencies are implementing tolling equity programs, including discounts. It really is a chance to be a leader for folks, and we really think that everyone has a role to play in making the U.S. A more equitable place to be and live. And also political and regulatory winds are shifting for many, if not all, agencies. And for us, at WSP, we're continuing to work with other states on tolling equity. We're also including equity-focused thinking and metrics and investment and policy prioritization and selection frameworks. And sort of lastly, and a little bit out there, tolling equity thinking is also spreading within the P3 world. We're seeing that it's an opportunity for communities and also for P3 operators to weave a lot more of this kind of thinking and action into those projects as well. So these are just the things that are on top of our mind right now moving forward. So thanks so much. Appreciate you being here and the time, and open to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Gabor, for a fantastic presentation. So before moving into the Q&A, I would like to remind attendees that they can log your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar platform, and also the presentation slides are available in the handouts along with the study report itself to download. So I will start with the first question. What got the industry to move forward so quickly on equity in the last few years?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. So, the industry writ large was really kind of pretty far behind on kind of implementing equity into infrastructure projects as of about 2019. And I think the racial justice protests in 2020 really kind of hit the industry like a freight train. And there's just a lot of change in how conversations were being had and where these conversations were being had. Almost a total sea change between sort of right before 2020 to late 2020. And that's been really exciting to see, and it's been really nice to see that our industry has in many ways felt like a leader in this conversation, and that's been exciting. And one of the sort of biggest, I think, shock moments in a good way was when various MPOs in California sort of withdrew funding approval for a number of projects that they have approved funding for on equity grounds, essentially saying that the process for evaluating these projects from an equity perspective had not been sufficient. And I think that really convinced people that this is being taken seriously.
Thank you. Going back to enrollment, why do so few people enroll in low-income toll programs?
Yeah, sure. There are a couple of reasons. One is just that oftentimes people don't know that these programs exist. And one thing that could work really well that I think by and large hasn't been tried is really advertising the program's existence on the road itself. This is something that works quite well for transit programs. Um, and the sort of second reason is that the programs that are out there, the benefit levels aren't very high. So for example, in LA, the benefit is effectively a one-time $25 credit and an annual $12 credit. That's roughly speaking how it works out. And the enrollment has to be done in person. And so, someone really has to have a lot of time and go out of their way to enroll in a program like this, usually, unless you go out of your way to make it really, really easy to enroll in. And the other thing that's sort of worth saying is by and large, finding sort of free time and free capacity to enroll in a program like this can be particularly hard for people with low incomes. Oftentimes they're working multiple jobs. Oftentimes they're not able to outsource household tasks, childcare, so on and so forth. So setting up a mechanism where they have to take a couple of hours to enroll can really limit how many people actually join.
Thank you. Can you clarify if the cash loading transactions free for users?
Yeah, sure. So generally speaking, they're not, and I think that's a bit of a shame. I think in most places there's usually some kind of a convenience fee, usually $1 or $2, to make a cash loading a cash loading transaction, at a grocery store or something like that. That is starting to change. There are a number of agencies that are starting to eat that cost themselves, and obviously that's a cost, and obviously cash transactions are more expensive for these agencies than credit card transactions, but there is something sort of profoundly inequitable to making these transactions more expensive by cash than by credit cards, because by and large the people making these transactions are people with lower incomes. So it's an important conversation to have.
Thank you. I will take the last question. Why would you roll out to a program like this as a pilot as opposed to a permanent program?
Yeah, sure. So there are pros and cons to doing a pilot, but by and large, people have found, I think, the pros to outweigh the cons a bit. So the biggest reason is that it just allows you to iterate to make sure that you're actually meeting the needs of the community in terms of how the program works. Are people actually enrolling? Are people making use of it today? Are they finding it valuable? And I think being able to make changes in future years as to how the program is actually implemented and how, so for example, how enrollment works and how the benefit is designed, I think can be really valuable. And it can take a few years to learn that kind of stuff. And that's the biggest benefit of a pilot. Obviously, the biggest con is that it puts it on a little bit of shaky ground. And I think by and large, especially in international development context, but within the US, I think there's just a big history of programs being sort of cut off after a couple of years, and I think people can be a little cynical about that. And so having some permanence to it is also helpful, but you can learn a lot from iterating, especially if you have an advisory committee whose sort of job and responsibility is to actually really evaluate kind of year to year whether it's working well.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Gabor, for a fantastic presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining today. Any additional questions that were unanswered will be answered directly by Gabor. So feel free to reach out to the presenter via the email shown on the screen. And thank you, everyone, for joining today. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks all.